Rise and shine, my dear grade 7 students. How is your day going so far? By the way, I am Miss Shelami D. Ator. Are you ready to learn some more? Come and join me. This discussion was designed to provide you with a fun and meaningful opportunities for guided and independent learning at your own pace and time. You will be enabled to process the contents of the learning resource while being an active learner. Before we are going to adventure our topic, let us recognize first our learning objectives. The first one is identify the relationships between ideas and words. Next, use analogy to make or describe a point. And lastly, appreciate the importance of using analogy to make or describe a point by writing a motto. Today, we are going to have a review on what you learned in the previous quarter. In this module, you will be able to intensify your previous knowledge about analogy, its definition, its different types, and deepen it even more. This time, we are going to describe or make a point using analogy. The exercises herein are made to motivate you to embrace learning as a meaningful experiences. It is hoped that the skills you learned will better prepare you to adjust to the new normal. Last quarter, you were exposed to analogy, right? What is an analogy? What are the types of analogy? When do we use analogy? To sharpen your prior knowledge, let us take first a pre-assessment. The activity easy? Were you able to answer all the questions? Well, if you didn't, don't worry. It is but the start of our review about our lesson and analogy. Today, we are going to look back on our previous knowledge and analogy, but this time, we are going to deepen that knowledge since we are going to use analogy to make or describe a point. But before everything else, let us review what we already know about analogy. Test 1 Direction. Complete the following analogies by choosing the pair of words that best expresses a relationship similar to that of the original pair. Write only the letter of the best answer. Congratulations! You have done well in the pre-assessment and in Task 1. Now, I want you to go back to the activities that you went through actively. Focus and try to get the important points about the lesson on using analogy to make or describe a point. When we speak of analogy, we show how two things are similar. However, if we use analogy to make or describe a point, it is not just merely presenting the resemblance of two things or ideas. We furthermore must make the comparison more tangible, specific, and effective. This lesson is interesting since it can get us to use our critical thinking skills. We need to be thinking logically and looking at the relationship of the first set of words and cascade it to the next page.
Learning Upgrade.
You're asking me, what is an analogy? It's a relation relationship between two words. Red is to stop, as is. Green is to what? At a red light you stop, at a green light you go. Tall is to short, as is. Big is to what? The opposite of tall is short. The opposite of big is small. What is an analogy? It's a relation.
Based on your prior knowledge, what is analogy? What is analogy? What is analogy? What is analogy? Well, analogy, the root of the word analogy, comes from an ancient Greek word that means proportionality. The Greeks used analogies to show the similarities between two words, usually for logical and argumentative process. An analogy, it is a literary device that creates a relationships based on parallels or connections between two ideas. By establishing this relationship, the new idea is introduced through a familiar comparison, thus making the new concept easier to grasp. This is done in an effort to create similarities between two subjects in order to give the reader an image and a point of comparison. Simple analogies compare two things using a common framework, while word analogies aren't often used in writing. The skill of making good comparisons and connections will help you better organize and explain your thoughts. You might find it helpful to describe an idea by explaining what it reminds you of. Analogies are useful when you're writing factual reports on ethics, while more poetic comparisons like similes and metaphors are helpful in descriptive poems and stories. People often confuse analogies with similes and metaphors, which are both figures of speech, right? However, they are actually very different, specifically because an analogy is a rhetorical device, not a figure of speech, while similes and metaphors are generally quite short and simple. Analogies are more elaborate and explanatory because they support arguments. Another example of analogy. Every choice you make is like spinning time, the wheel of fortune. Sometimes you will get the result that you desire, while other lines you will end up with something you always hope to avoid. In this example, the writer could have said, every choice has different consequences, but like similes, analogies make associations between things that wouldn't usually be compared, like choices to wheels of fortune and life to gardens. These comparisons create better descriptions and sensory images in the minds of readers. As mentioned, analogies are more elaborate and informational than similes or metaphors, providing support for the comparisons made rather than just starting them as simple truths. So try not to confuse analogies to similes and metaphors. They are similar but not quite, only in the comparing part. Similes and metaphors are usually concise and simple, while analogies are more detailed and expanded because they have a point to prove. Another example of an analogy is saying that searching for a good man is like searching for a needle in a haystack. Of course, when you first look at this sentence, it seems to make no sense at all, right? However, if you think about it, There's a deep meaning to it. Finding a needle in a haystack is very difficult. It's almost impossible, and it's really tedious and hard. The sum applies to searching for a good man, which would take someone's effort, time, and to do so. And doing so can also be tiring and hard. Another example is that memory is to love what the saucer is to the cup. From the House of Paris, Elizabeth Bruman. This analogy compares the relationship between a cup and a saucer to that of love and memory. Memory holds love as a saucer holds the cup. And now let's proceed on how to write a good analogy. What are the steps in making a good analogy? Are there steps in making to it or guidelines? Well, come and we're going to discover. If you want to incorporate solid analogies in your writing, here are some tips that will help you get your point across in a recreation. 1. Offer common, easily understood objects. So what does it mean? If you want to help your reader understand a concept, make sure to choose an example that is familiar and easy to understand for your readers. For example, if you want to find an analogy to describe the education of children, it may be simpler to use the analogy of gardening, which most people have some experience with, as opposed to something like boat building. Second, think about similarities and differences between your objects. What does it mean? Well, while you may want to use an analogy to show how one item is like another, you should also pay attention to how they are different. Take the opportunity to explain the similarities and differences. Sometimes, you may even stumble upon important imagery that you can use as you think of possible connections. You got it? And lastly, aim to inspire your readers. So how you are going to inspire your readers? One mark of a good analogy is that it becomes memorable enough to inspire action. You can do this by selecting a word or picture that will stay with your readers in the long run. This may possibly be why the parables that Jesus told in the Bible are very memorable. He made analogies using familiar, everyday objects such as wet, fishing, and digging for treasure. When to use analogy? Analogies can be an extremely powerful addition to your writing. So experiment. Using analogies is a really useful skill for informing the powers of logic, reasoning, and writing, and the best way to learn it is to practice. When you experiment with analogies in your writing, keep the following principles in mind. First, make sure it's clear what aspects of the two objects you want to compare. Second, draw an analogy to something concrete, ideally something that people can actually visualize in their minds. If you're trying to explain an abstract idea, it doesn't help to compare it to another abstract idea, but it might help a lot if you compare it to something tangible. Lastly, if you're using analogies in creative writing, make sure they are suited to the setting. If the story is set on a boat, try to use analogies having to do with water or islands. Remember the example with the sand and the snow? In that case, the problem was that the setting was all wrong. Snow doesn't belong on a warm, sandy beach. You got it? To sum it up, So, we need to remember what analogies are and its different types, plus the steps on how to make good analogies. We just need to use our higher order thinking skills in order to get the meaning and to drive to our point. I am sure that you all are ready to trunkle and adventure our journey to activities. Say adventure. Adventure! That's great. And now come and join me. Fantastic! You've answered the different activities to sharpen your skills in using analogy to make or describe a point. Let us now evaluate your learning. And now, let us try some more. Search for a motto that uses an analogy. Your original motto is preferred. The motto should be how you want to do in the coming year. This is a fun way to start creating analogies while also reflecting on your own personal goals. Be creative and be guided with the rubrics that follow. Excellent! You all did a good job. This is Miss Shalami D. Ator saying, never give up. Stay optimistic and life must go on. Thank you everyone for sparing your time and joining me to this adventure. Goodbye and enjoy the rest of the day.